it was an international issue as to whether or not the mayor of Toronto would walk in pride. And many people who had supported me said, this will kill you if you do this. There was a massive scrum of journalists from all over. I walked in the parade, and the next year, other leaders walked in the parade, and it's standing up and saying, look, the sky is not falling. This community is as entitled to being there and supporting and celebrating them as any other community.
Much has been written in journals, papers, and books by a significant group of academics and authors about feminism and the equality movement. And there's a growing inventory of productions about women in Canadian life. We want to add more. The Women's History Project is a nonprofit organization launched in 2022. Our ambition is to promote and showcase women in Canadian history. We want trailblazers, leaders, authors, and historians to tell stories about women in the labor movement, at work, in the media, women who took to the streets, equal pay, maternity benefit, the right to have your own bank account. We want to get women who are still living to recount their challenges and campaign. History is rich with stories about advocates, activists, and women in public life at the community, provincial, and national levels, across Canada, in small towns, on farms, in urban areas, women who have used their voice to make a difference. This is 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories. Barbara Hall, community worker, lawyer, municipal politician, grassroots champion. Barbara served as the 61st Mayor of Toronto, the second woman to be mayor. Known as a passionate activist supporting marginalized communities, Barbara worked with Black families in Nova Scotia early in her career, and by the age of 20, worked for Toronto youth programs. Barbara was called to the Ontario Bar in 1980, elected to Toronto City Hall in 1985, and as mayor in 1994. As mayor, Barbara focused on economic growth for the city, large construction projects including Air Canada Centre, improvements to downtown residential neighborhoods. She supported affordable housing initiatives and helped introduce violence against women as a national political issue. She was the first mayor to march in the city's Pride Parade. In 2005, Barbara was appointed Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. While she was Commissioner, the OHRC dismissed a complaint by the Canadian Islamic Congress against Maclean's, but Barbara called out Maclean's for Islamophobia, suggesting they perpetuate stereotypes. She also recommended in an earlier report communities across Ontario to have an open dialogue and act on racism. Barbara was inducted as a member of the Order of Canada in 2015.
Thank you, Barbara, for joining us for this particular episode. This episode, we're talking to Barbara Hall, community worker, lawyer, municipal politician, and a grassroots initiative champion. Former politician serving as the 61st Mayor of Toronto from 1984 to 1987, the second woman in Toronto to be mayor, Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and a passionate activist known for her work supporting marginalized communities. Barbara, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
You've got a long and distinguished career as a community and human rights activist and advocate, and a distinguished career in politics, elected as mayor of Toronto and in public service. But let's start at the beginning. Tell us about your early years and the influences that led you to your interest in things like anti-racism, youth programming, community development.
Well, I think one of the things was the fact that my dad was in the Navy, the Canadian Navy, and as a result, we moved often. Halifax, Victoria, Ottawa, London, England, sort of many different homes and many different schools. And so in some ways, I was sort of an outsider often. I was the new kid standing at the front of the class and the teacher saying, we have a new girl today, everybody be nice to Barbara, or whatever. So I was often on the outside, having to figure out how to get in, to know people to like me, be engaged in what was happening. And And my mother was a social worker, a very direct service kind of social worker who I think she often worked outside of the normal role. So, you know, I can remember a number of times sort of her looking in my closet and me say, "Mom, what are you looking for?" And she'd say, "Susan has been invited to a high school dance, and she's no longer running away or working on the streets or whatever. She's actually going to a dance, and we need a dress for her." And so this one would be good, and I'd be excited that Susan was going to the dance and wearing my dress and making some changes and finding a more positive pathway in her life.
Where a lot of women didn't work outside the home.
Well, my mother volunteered for a long time because my father did not allow her to work because that meant he was incapable of supporting his family. So she worked a lot, setting up a mental health association in Halifax in the late 50s and being involved with many different community organizations, and then finally
to be a volunteer and to organize things, but not to actually
not to be paid, even though our family needed the money. You know, my father was a mid-ranking naval officer, not high pay, whatever. But you know, she talked about issues. And the other thing, sort of combining two of those things, we lived in England for a couple of years, and when we came back to Canada, we came on a ship from Venice to Halifax. I loved traveling, and this was very exciting. We'd stop in various ports and go ashore for the day, come back in the evening, and the jetty would be packed with people all dressed in black, often wailing, a sort of mourning kind of wail. And they were sending their young men to Canada or New York, ironically, many of them to build the subway in Toronto. Wow. And the kind of immigration where in the 50s, many villages in Italy had no source of revenue economy, and they were immigrating. And I was so bothered by it. And why are they crying? Why are they wailing? And my parents would say, well, they may not ever see their family again. Well, why are they going then? Well, because they're poor. Well, you know, why can't the family, all these questions. And when we got to Halifax, and we lived in Halifax after that for a couple of years, I kept asking questions. And my parents got me from the Halifax library, I think, every book on immigration and the sort of social issues related to that. Mostly American, you know, Jane Addams, Hull House, the impact of immigration on social services, child welfare, public health, you know, all of that stuff. And I just had to know what was going to happen to them here and would they be okay. And I think that led me into a lot of other things.
How old were you when you lived in England?
We were, when I was 9 until 12.
So do you remember a lot of that time? Because that would have been...
That was we lived in London, on Cheney Row, and, you know, we lived on a street that had conservative MPs but council flats and a whole mix of people. And London was really coming to life after the war, there were still a lot of places bombed out, but also theater,
Yeah.
life on the street.
I lived in London. I lived in the UK for 17 years. My daughters came with me and were teenagers in London from 97 to 2001, 2002.
Well, that's where I got my passion for cities and the sort of denseness of cities that could work, the diversity that made cities work well.
But I remember my youngest daughter when she was at the American school, and it really struck me. She came home one day, she was 10 years old, and she goes, Mom, she goes, so proud every time I see the Canadian flag. Every time we go through the school, the main entrance, and she saw the Canadian flag. There was a lot of international students, a lot of international flags. She was so proud of that Canadian flag. And all of a sudden, she understood what patriotism was at the age of 10 because she was not living in Canada. It was so, I wanted to know if that was kind of your...
Well, my dad was in the military, so we went to, all the things, and very proud. We all had maple leaf pins that we wore, but at our school, a small private school, there were quite a few people from various embassies, so we got to know and be good friends with kids from all over, and sort of understood the impact of international events. I can remember having friends who were Egyptian who suddenly were gone. They were in school on Tuesday, we planned to do whatever. On Wednesday, they were gone because of the Suez dispute, that kind of thing.
So living abroad really changes your perception of where you're from or what some of the priorities are. So that's what I find of interest. And then when you were in Halifax as a teenager, you did some work with a company of young Canadians?
No, I went to junior high in Halifax. Then we moved to BC. I went to high school and did my undergrad at UVic. And then after, in 1966, I joined the first group of volunteers with the Company of Young Canadians. And that's when I went to a project in Nova Scotia.
Okay. But those youth employment programs, Company of Young Canadians, and later on, opportunities for youth, were really important training grounds or work opportunities to keep young people busy, give them a little bit of money. But that's where a lot of activists came out of.
Yeah. 1966, our goal was to change the world. And CYC was very activist and seen as, you were a community organizer who went into communities. So I was in a rural Black community, lived in a house trailer. I always joke that my first community project was getting some of the people in the community to help me build an outhouse because there was no indoor plumbing for me or for anyone else in the community. So 1966. So I lived there, I worked there, I spent all my time there, I became part of families there, and through people there, I learned a lot about racism and the hard racism in Nova Scotia.
It had a large Black community. Nova Scotia has quite a large Black community.
Yeah, going back to really to the American Revolution, when people got land grants in Nova Scotia for staying loyalists, yeah. But the communities were all on the outskirts of towns, yeah. where I went, 3 Mile Plains, was just outside of Windsor, Nova Scotia. And generally speaking, the land was crummy, it was rocky, it was not good farming land, that kind of thing. And when I was there in the 60s, the only jobs in Windsor that blacks could get was as cleaning houses.
So
and
how did you take that responsibility to the next, that responsibility, that experience to the next level and get more involved in social movements or, in the anti-racism movement? So tell us what that looked like.
Well, after leaving CYC, I moved to Toronto. Well, my first job was in a coffee house on Yorkville, so I was a skinny, long-haired hippie, I guess, who loved music.
Oh my gosh, that would have been...
But I got a job at Central Neighborhood House in the sort of Cabbagetown area of Toronto as a street worker, which meant I worked with kids on the street. Fewer kids on the street in those days than now. The kids tended to have problems at home, problems at school, and problems with the law. Drugs were just expanding, the whole sort of drug thing, and the kids were getting in trouble.
Yeah, but the drugs are not the same kind of drugs. They're now very lethal.
So working with the kids, many of the kids in the Cabbagetown area where I worked were actually Francophones, Acadians from northern New Brunswick, whose families had come to Toronto, and there was the Catholic school in the area was a Francophone one, a Francophone church, but also as immigration was changing and expanding, more racialized kids and families were moving into the area. So seeing how, for example, the police were sort of transferring some of their, what I saw as discriminatory behavior towards poor kids, maybe poor white kids, they were now transferring this to newcomer groups.
Yeah, so there was a policing issue. There was biases in the police, obviously.
I married an American and moved in 72 to Cleveland, and got a job as a juvenile probation officer after being robbed at gunpoint and having to go to court, and I'd been a youth worker in Canada, that kind of thing. That came up in the evidence, and I think I took on the defense lawyer who was hassling me, and I got into a debate with him about guns. Anyway, at the end of the hearing, as I walked out, the bailiff asked if I'd stay and speak to the judge, and he said, "We need feisty people like you here, and would you apply for..."
But that would have been a tough job, because whatever problems Toronto had, I expect Cleveland had a lot worse problems.
So it was after 2 years in Cleveland, my marriage fell apart, and I came back to Canada, and I went to law school.
What kind of law did you practice after, or did you practice law after?
Yeah, criminal, primarily, although some starting out in a small practice, a mishmash of things. But I went because of my experience as a probation officer, really, in the courts. And that was a time when legal aid was not quite there yet, and very little law that protected people, so that, you know, landlord and tenant laws, social service review board, you know, things like that were being fought for. And that was my interest in going to law, was related to poverty issues.
And that's where you became a social justice advocate or activist.
Yeah, it was really,
Protect the.
it was really then. Housing, lack of affordable housing was a big issue for me, related to cases where families stayed together when the wife was at risk because there was no housing to move out to.
Oh, that's
So,
interesting. Women stay.
so
At the time, you know, there were no shelters, or there were fewer shelters. The shelter movement just started in the early 70s.
yeah.
So if there were problems, there was nowhere to go unless you had another family member somewhere else that could take you in. And they often
but to move, so people who would, clients who would move out with their children, but not enough money in the family, if it was divided between, tried to meet the needs of both spouses and children, just wasn't enough, and they moved back in.
So if your focus was on things like, you know, social services and, you know, poverty, anti-poverty, you know, the anti-racism, at that time there's still then a growing women's movement. Did you ever intersect with them? You must have, you know, because there's a certain group of women who were activists still dealing with the same issues, but really much more with a feminist perspective. So I would expect you to all be in similar circles.
Yeah, there were certainly lots of things in terms of the issues and the law. You know, abortion, for example, was a big thing, where I was a big supporter and activist, and, you know, met people like Judy Rebick in those days, and Dr. Morgenthaler and others, and so a lot of overlap. I mean, a lot of housing things were particularly crucial for women, and I was there fighting generally for more affordable housing. And
Christine and I talked a lot about housing issues yesterday, because she was into social housing issues and working for the Metro Housing Commission. I think she said it was.
it was Metro Housing Company at that point.
Yeah. So the housing issue. So there would have been a group of women who just, your paths would have crossed because of these were the issues that you were tackling.
You know, at law school, a lot of women, a lot of older women, we were called mature students, but older, you know, like 30 as opposed to 19, who had a lot of working experience, tended to group together. Yesterday was the 44th anniversary of Barbara Schleifer's death, murder. And we were in the same class at law school. So we were part of a group who went out together the night we were called to the bar. And that was when Barbara went home on the Queen car. She got home to a murderer. But a group of women who were very concerned about violence against women and different aspects of that.
I had not heard that story, but I do know about the Barbara
Schleifer and then the clinic that was set up in her memory.
I did not know that. So she was murdered. And then and we were talking earlier, I was talking earlier today about some of the gender-based violence issues, and there was many decades nobody would talk about it, and they didn't talk about it in the Royal Commission on the status of women, but it was the shelter movement in the 1970s that really started to make noises about how bad this was.
Well, Barbara's murder was by a young man who she didn't know, who was sort of hiding in the lobby of her building when she came in. And you're right that those issues were not talked about. One of the reasons my marriage broke up was because of violence. And as a politician, as well as, wearing other hats, I've talked about that. I have said, I can remember once at a committee at City Hall where we were doing something, moving something about violence against women, and one of the male counselors said, "Oh, that's not a big issue. I don't know anyone who's, been subject to it." And I said, "Yes, you do." And no, why are you saying that? And I said, "Well, you know me. I'm a fairly assertive person, and yet I experienced this over a period of my marriage, and it took me a while for all the same reasons that it has taken many other women over the years to blame ourselves, to put up with it, to,
For whatever reason, to stay instead of leave.
That's right.
And I'm not sure it's a lot better. There's still issues, and it's exacerbated now because the violence is sometimes a lot more insidious because it's now online. It's bullying, it's the date rapes at universities. It's not just...
No, there are many, many different places where violence, control, harassment, all the surveillance things that go with social media.
Yeah, and the other, when I was working at Women and Gender Equality, of course, we were taking a look at some of the intersectionality of some of these issues. So if women, if there's a lot of gender-based violence or violence against women, if you're a lesbian or a trans woman, if you are a disabled woman, if you're Black or Indigenous, it was even worse.
That's right.
So that we have to be really mindful that this is not just a little problem. This is a huge problem, and it gets really bad for a whole lot of groups. So nothing has really changed.
I was practicing law at the time of the bathhouse raids in Toronto, and was horrified to see how gay men were treated by the police. And I became part of a group called the Right to Privacy Committee that provided legal services for men who were arrested and often and charged, and often, lost their families, their jobs, their whatever. And that got me engaged in issues in the gay community around AIDS, but more broadly, in issues in the lesbian community, and on until my time at the Human Rights Commission, when I really got educated by members of the trans community and fought for, and we finally got the inclusion of gender identity and gender orientation into the Human Rights Code.
This was much later.
Yes.
This was after you've been mayor, so we are going to cover a little bit about that. But the original question was, I'm sure that your work you would have crossed paths with all these women in the feminist movement, because you are dealing with the same issues.
Absolutely, and as you said, lots of intersection.
And then how did you become mayor? So were you a councillor first?
Yeah, I was a councillor.
You were a councillor first.
I became a councillor because the then councillor, who had sort of been the big advocate for social housing on Toronto City Council, David Revel, resigned and to run provincially, where he became, in the Bob Rae government, Minister of Housing. Anyway, he and others persuaded me to run and sort of fill that spot, that gap in council around housing and affordable housing. I represented inner city wards, so St. Jamestown, Regent Park, Moss Park, many co-op housing units and supportive housing, and really the center of social housing in the city.
Just to take a little side trip here, you must look at some of the housing issues now about affordable. You must look back at your time dealing with all these issues, and it's decades later, and there's now different types or different reasons for the problem, but it's still a problem.
Well, you know, it goes back to then. I mean, there were housing issues and needs at that time, but they were much smaller, and there were active housing programs, active co-op housing programs that were regularly creating new units and, you know, giving new people opportunities to move into that housing. When I was mayor, quite early in my time as mayor, I got a call from Mike Harris, who was premier, who just called to give me an alert that later that day he would be canceling all of the social housing projects in the city of Toronto underway. There were 23 of them. Now, some of them could have been, you know, 12 units, and some of them were 110 units, but all of those that had been, you know, worked on for several years, rezonings, all kinds of things, partway, they all had provincial funding in them, and they were all stopped. And so that was the serious start of the backing out. And then the feds also reducing their role, and so nothing was being done to deal with any of the new people, the new families who needed housing. And so it's just accumulated.
And there's so much more immigration now than there was then. I remember the days when Canada was like 20 million people, and now it's like 40 million people.
Right.
Got to put them somewhere. So during your time as mayor, a number of initiatives were brought under your leadership to improve the cities and lives. Looking back at that time in your career, is there anything that stands out to you as something you are particularly proud to have led? Or let's step back. You were a councillor for how many years? And then you were...
For 3 terms, so 9 years.
9 years, and then you ran for mayor. And you weren't the first woman mayor.
Ironically, I ran against and defeated the first woman mayor, and we had been councillors together, June Rowlands. A lot of respect for her and the work she did. June would have made a great city manager. She really focused on the details of the budget, for example. So she would disappear for weeks, you know, looking at every number in the budget and not out meeting with people, with groups. She liked to lecture people. Toronto was going through some difficult times financially. There needed to be some vitality and something to bring people together and give them hope and make things happen. So I ended up firstly looking around to see who else would run for mayor, and then the fingers seemed to be pointing at me, and the possibility of being mayor of a city like Toronto, the largest city, even in a smaller form, the largest city in Canada, and the ability to influence really urban issues across the country was not something that you turned your back on. And
I worked on 2 campaigns for Jackie Holtzman in Ottawa, and she was a lovely mayor.
yeah, she was.
Jackie and I are still, really good friends. So any political work I did, I would have done it at the municipal, and she was a well-known associate. She was conservative, so and that's how we got to meet conservatives, because he got to work on a municipal campaign. But to work at the municipal level and those issues, then to work at a provincial level and deal with those issues, or to work at a federal level. So it was really quite interesting. I loved, and I actually worked at a city council in the UK, Birmingham. I loved city issues. I loved and in the UK, city issues included education.
Well, I was often asked about running provincially and federally, and really had no interest in doing that. Before I ran municipally, I ran in a provincial campaign for the NDP. This was when I was practicing law. I ran knowing there was no hope at all of me winning, and it was sort of to fly the flag. And in fact, I ran against Ian Scott.
Oh, yes.
And Ian and I became great friends. And when I ran for mayor, Ian was one of the co-chairs of my campaign.
And he became the Attorney General under
Yes.
Anderson's government.
I found municipal issues gave you a possibility of, working together and bringing people together, and not having partisanship
Yes.
be a major role, so that you could have these people supporting you, tomorrow these people, and in between, everyone coming together, so that the sort of more divides of party politics did not appeal to me.
In the UK, they are very partisan. So city council, you are
Right.
conservative, liberal.
No, I remember when Thatcher killed the Greater London
Yeah.
Council, and
Yeah.
whereas we in Canada, you say Jackie Holtzman, Diane Holmes,
Yes.
who was a longtime councillor, she was a group who I met with at Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and we would 3 times a year meet and talk about housing, about policing, about all the various issues with people in municipalities right across the country. And those relationships were important around policing and getting the chiefs of Canada to support gun control.
And in the UK, we were dealing with issues like anti-terrorism. We were trying to deal with, the different communities fighting each other. We were dealing with education. We were dealing with emergencies, the emergency planning, resilience, because they expected, at any time a bomb could go off. If that were the case, what do you do? How do you get the city back together? So we were dealing with some really interesting issues. I love the cultural issues that you deal with at the city level. There's some, it's not just, bins and traffic lights.
Well, people would say, "Oh my gosh, you and Max are never at home at night. You're out every night." And say, yeah, we've missed the movies, but we travel around the world. We go, had a lot of involvement with many of the diverse communities in Toronto, and a good relationship, and went to their events, and met with their young people and their old people and the families in between, and just working to support them to find and then play a role in their new society.
When you look at the city council now and the representation and the diversity, how does that make you feel?
Oh, I love it. And in the last municipal election in Toronto, a number of very bright young people from diverse communities were elected. And
it's hard to get elected to municipal council if an incumbent is
that's
running.
right.
So you have to wait till that incumbent retires or
No, and you know, that's one of the tragedies, I guess. But there has, in the last few years, been a lot of turnover. One of the things that's quite wonderful for me, you know, I'll be on the subway and a young woman will say, I hope I'm not bothering you, but, you know, are you Barbara Hall or something? And then they'll tell me, you came, when you were mayor, you came to my grade 4 class and you talked to us about how it was our city and we should get involved. And I'm now running or would like to run, or I'm taking political science, or, you know, if I go to partisan, if I go, for example, Liberal or NDP events, many women will come up to me and say, you made me understand that I could play a role here, and you know, that's
so you
enormously
way for other young women to get involved at a municipal level. That's interesting. But you're right, you mentioned before you were mayor of Toronto. This is a big city. You know, Charlotte Whitten was the first mayor of a smaller city.
Right.
But this is the big city.
Well, you know, from my time practicing law on the bathhouse raids, I got involved in issues in the gay, lesbian, trans, two-spirited, queer communities, and had been involved in Pride for a number of years. When I became mayor, an issue in the campaign was whether or not I would walk in the Pride Parade. This was certain people who thought that was inappropriate to do. And I always said yes. To me, it was part of my year, part of Max's and my year, that Pride was a big summer celebration. And the first year after I was mayor, it was an international issue as to whether or not the mayor of Toronto would walk in Pride. And many people who had supported me said, this will kill you if you do this. There was a massive scrum of journalists from all over. I walked in the parade, and I still have mainly men who stop me and say, thank you for doing that. I phoned my mother in Thunder Bay and said, Mom, the mayor of Toronto's walking in Pride, and maybe one day my mother will support me the way you support me. And the next year, other leaders walked in the parade, that it now became the thing, and future mayors walked in the parade. And it's the thing of standing up and saying, look, the sky is not falling. This community is as entitled to its mayor being there and supporting and celebrating them as any other community. So, you know, things that at the time don't seem that major take some guts on some level, I guess, to, you know, a lot of people are saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And I did it, and
sky didn't fall.
and the sky didn't fall, and the community became more accepted as a result of that. And the crowds started to change from jeering, nasty crowds to families coming out and cheering and smiling and laughing and celebrating and openly accepting their
I remember
their children.
struck walking because it's a long parade too. And everybody was just so happy. It was a big celebration. I had been to some of the Pride events in Birmingham, in London, in Montreal, but this one was really quite spectacular. This one was really, and you were mayor before amalgamation.
Yes. I was the last mayor before amalgamation. So
did you agree with the amalgamation or
we organized
against it?
We organized against it, and we asked them to do a vote, and they refused. So we did one. So we were, and I was very active in the anti-amalgamation movement, and
I was very involved in the anti-amalgamation, and he did a lot of municipal work. So he was not a fan, and then the government did it anyway.
So what part of no don't you understand, Mr. Harris, was one of the things we said after, but...
it got even worse when it was a couple of years ago when they decided to take city council and cut the council by a good number without telling them just at the time there was the election.
Right. No, there's been a lot of anti-Toronto things, and I think some of the issues that Toronto faces today are the result of amalgamation taking attention away from running and managing a city to figuring out how to amalgamate, how to deal with, two sets of workers on the same truck with being paid different amounts with different job descriptions and whatever. So a lot of our infrastructure has really declined since then because the amalgamation had no planning going with it, insufficient resources, a lot of unfortunate things.
Having worked at a city council where we were going through great cutbacks because Westminster wasn't giving as much money to local governments as they once had, that's a lot of work to try to transform your services in a way that makes sense, that you can still actually get the services done. The big cutbacks, and that takes a lot of work. That's just not an easy thing to do.
And some of that's always happening in government, or it should always be happening, because
But you were taking
the city changes. This was everything, and taking
11 communities, making it one big one, something like that.
6 municipalities. So
6 municipalities, bringing it into one. They could have done one at a time. They didn't. Anyway, moving on from municipal politics, your work as the Ontario Human Rights Commission. You're involved in several high-profile cases with investigations, particularly around topics of racial profiling and discrimination. What are your observations about Canadian society and how the press has dealt with these issues then and to now?
Well, it's hard for me to generalize about the press and the media because, some of the media has really focused on the issues in a good way. So racial profiling, carding, and some of the press has clearly come from the position of thinking that was okay, and then others understanding the enormous cost that racialized communities, and particularly young men in those communities, have played as a result of the systemic racism within policing. And we at the Human Rights Commission when I was there, did a lot of work on that issue. And, you know, some progress in, well, we got rid of carding, but, you know, it's the whole systemic bias against many groups, but
Has it changed at all?
yeah, I think it's changed. One, the carding is no longer permitted. There's a lot of training within policing, and there are many police officers who have benefited from that training and education and learning, and then there are a whole pile of others who can continue on, and so we still see it almost daily or weekly. There's another case somewhere, maybe involving Indigenous people, involving racialized communities. So I think it's more out there, and when it occurs in blatant ways, a lot of people will come out and support those who've experienced it, but
Or the issues may be much more subtle now. So, you know, whatever the issues were about people, you know, blacks at the back of the bus, people not being able to sit at certain or going to certain buildings, that's obviously gone. But there are things that were probably being much more subtle that would be really difficult to.
well, it you know, every area. So we see that you know, many employers, for example, are doing a lot of work around diversity and inclusion, and making changes and educating and giving opportunities and promoting people who in the past were ignored, or just doing entry-level work, that kind of thing. I mean, in many places there, I mean, if we look at our representatives in government, it's more reflective.
So certainly in the federal public service, there are huge discussions around, and one of the women I interviewed a couple of months ago, Denise Chong, who I worked with in the 1980s. She was an economic policy advisor to the Prime Minister. And when she left politics, she got involved in a task force that took a look at visible minorities in the federal public service. And she wrote the report. And they're implementing a lot of those recommendations. And so what they're doing now, there's a lot of training involved. It's very accessible. It's absolutely mandatory. A lot of the human rights issues, they're really pushing very, very hard. So the promotions and the anti-racism. So I know that from personal experience. They're doing a lot of really good work, and I expect that filters out too.
Well, it's sort of every sector. Right. Most sectors are involved. How effective it is, you know, the jury's still out on that, and you can go through all the programs in the world, and if your mindset is that you're going to resist that, and I can remember going to the Ontario Police College where, you know, police services would be there and people would come and, you know, fold their arms and be determined that they weren't going to hear or just roll their eyes or not be influenced by the programs they were required to take. So there's, you know, it keeps going down layers, layers, layers. And if one looks at discrimination, exclusion of Indigenous people and all the layers of that, and for many other communities as well. So it requires an ongoing vigilance, always vigilance, all these areas. I mean, I think many of my peers, people like me in their late 70s, sometimes 80s, who worked on issues and believed that that had been taken care of, in a sense, that those laws or requirements dealt with certain issues. And now, seeing that many things are being rolled back or attempted to be rolled back, of course, looking to the south.
Coming back in a different way too. So again, things are a lot more subtle, or else it's now some things are more subtle, but other things are more visible because of social media.
Yeah. You know, I sometimes think, thank God I was not doing all these things I did during the time of social media. I know that takes an enormous toll
100% of the same thing
on people who are just destroyed by it, and
women in particular. So somebody close to me wanted me to ask you this about the Barber Hall Park, right beside the 519 Community Center, and he thought this should be a place of joy, and he says it's not. It's probably one of the toughest parks in the city, and a lot of people are hurting. And have you thought of how that could be fixed, and have you made any calls to the mayor and say, let's clean this up?
that park, I mean, for me, it's a great honor to have a park that includes the AIDS Memorial and the Trans Memorial in that location is important. There are lots of issues there and lots of people with mental health and addiction issues who are hanging out there. I regularly walk through that park, and I've been invited and have been on for the last year an advisory committee that the City Parks and Rec have put together with business people from the area and residents and 519 and various groups looking at ways to address those issues. It's a tough park. Sadly, there are many tough parks in our city, and I would not consider that to be one of the worst. I think there are issues there. There are people trying to provide other options for people there, but it's part of the whole failure of having enough housing, having enough support, how we as a society deal with the drug issues, a lot of things like that, and so it's complicated. And I know for residents in the neighborhood don't always feel comfortable to go to the park, which they should be able to be.
But that's endemic of a lot of cities. There's pockets of areas where, the homeless or people that need shelters, the mental health, the addicts. I mean, I do some work in Ottawa, or I have done some work in Ottawa at the Shepherds of Good Hope.
Right.
So I see these pockets. So
Yeah.
this is not anything about the Barber Hall Park.
No.
Process.
But sadly, it's not unique, and there are many parks, some much larger and some tiny, that exhibit those same issues that are serious urban issues.
We're coming close to the end, so I wanted to just give us an opportunity of all the parts of your career. And, you know, there's threads certainly about, you know, the social justice and the anti-racism, the poverty, and the women's movement, you know, on the fringes of the movement, or getting involved in the women's movement, you know, more at one time than the other. I mean, what are the things that give you hope now? And what are the things that are still, you think, God, we've got to finish doing this?
Well, certainly housing is a big one, and things in relation to addiction, which is really causing urban areas across the country really to be in trouble. But one of the things that I'm proud of from my time as mayor is called by some people the two kings, King Parliament and King Spadina. I mentioned that I lived in Cleveland in the early 70s, and I saw how that city, like many American cities, the core had gutted out. So there were some office buildings, bank buildings during the day, but at night everyone left, and there was sort of wasteland around there. And in the 90s, 80s and 90s, Toronto was moving towards that. The old King Spadina and King Parliament, previous industrial areas,
Yes.
where the old industrial buildings were not what the 21st century industry needed, and many owners were tearing them down. It was better for them to have a surface parking lot than to have a vacant building that they couldn't rent. And the zoning only permitted industrial, no residential in those areas. And I brought together a group of people, interesting group of people, including people like Jane Jacobs, Ken Greenberg, people who are very progressive urban thinkers, as well as developers, heritage people, real estate, I said developers, business people, to look at what we could do to make something happen and to strengthen the downtown of the city. And so we ended up with rezoning 2 large areas and allowing virtually any use in those areas, including residential, as long, you know, you couldn't have, you know, a stockyard or something that was noxious, environmentally noxious, but otherwise you could mix uses. So you could have industrial, modern industrial, commercial, residential uses all in those neighborhoods. So now, instead of those areas being vacant, there are whole communities that have grown in the King Spadina, the King Parliament areas. And as people, as families have come to those areas, all the services, the retail things have come. A lot of infrastructure was already there.
Yeah. I remember we did that in Birmingham. We had the big city plan, and you know, Birmingham had been a very industrial city in the UK, really industrial, city of 1,000 trades, they called it. And they took brownfields and they put in mixed use. So, you know, office buildings, fabulous restaurants, you know, posh apartments, and they really, the regeneration efforts in Birmingham turned the city. I remember my partner, when we went to Birmingham, he cried because he had never seen anything so pretty compared to when, you know, 1960s, it was horrible. So there's a lot of the regeneration efforts are really something to be proud of.
You know, our core
Yeah.
grew and became stronger than probably any other core city in North America. And a large number of people who work downtown, who live downtown, who walk to work, you know, the big issue became the king car. The streetcar couldn't deal with the capacity and how to deal with things like that, cyclists, people walking, and
Those would be huge accomplishments.
a big improvement. I mean, COVID came and you know, created a number of other issues for the core, all those high-rise commercial buildings and things that, and the underground shopping area, which is all struggling in a big way. A new set of issues related to that, but I think what came out of that was the creation of a strong core mixed-use city. So I feel good about that.
I really enjoy talking about urban affairs. Thank you very much. So the last question I usually like to end on this is, would you do it all again? Would you do it differently?
I would do it all again. I loved it. I felt so good about working with many diverse people on many different issues and making people understand and believed that their contribution was important, that they could make a difference, and getting involved and making a difference. So that was wonderful, and I feel enormously lucky in my lifetime, in my adult lifetime, my career, whatever, that I've been able to find work that allowed me to live my passion, live it, and work towards a more inclusive, healthy community. And so yes, I would do it again.
And what would you tell young people how to do it? What would you get?
Well, I think one of the big things is doing a lot of listening, in finding ways to bring people together and hear from all of them, you know, doing that kind of inclusive discussion about what can happen, what needs to happen, how it can happen. People, you know, going back to my time in 3 Mile Plains, this poor community, no indoor plumbing, wells, racism keeping you out of the town, and yet within that community, many people, particularly the moms, you know, they took on issues and they made change happen. You know, they needed some allies to take it broader, but people can do an awful lot if you respect them, if you listen to them, and work together with them.
You know, one of my greatest joys about this particular project is I look at a generation of women who are a little bit older than me. Some of them are, you know, a couple of generations older than me. And sometimes we look at older people and we think they're a little bit invisible. And what I have found the most exciting about this week, talking to you all, is that you were the rabble-rousers of the 1960s and 70s. You were the movers and shakers. You were the young women who really wanted to, you know, fix the world. And I want to make sure that young women know that when they look at us or they look at those older generations, we are not the grandmothers. We were the, you know, you were the ones that really got us here. So for this is giving me the greatest joy, is to be able to share that.
Well, you know, one of the things in relation to that is to continue to be in places where, you know, there are young people, to go and to listen to their plans and find ways to support them and to show that some of your experience, some of my experience is relevant.
Yes.
And some of it isn't. And so if you take what from me is relevant and what from them is relevant, then often we can make things happen. And clearly social media and all of that they have enormous skills in, and I'm a total, Luddite. Put that together with my very personal, knock on every door, talk with people on the street, at the supermarket, the guy panhandling on the street. Hey, Barb, what do you think of this or that? Or
This has been a joy. Thank you very, very much. Barbara, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
my pleasure. Thank you. And I'm so impressed with the work you're doing.
I'm Deborah Davis, president and co-founder of the Women's History Project. This has been the Women's History Project production, with thanks to our sponsors, partners, and special guests. Please like us, follow us, subscribe, and share. You can find out more about our first season of 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories on our website, www.womenshistoryproject.ca.